Okay, thank you guys. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I did my project on the Ustore vendor scorecards, creating vendor scorecards for the university store. I have worked there for almost 18 months, and it's been a great compliment to the learning to see what I learned played out. Next slide. Again, this is a table of contents. Next slide. Okay, I'm assuming everyone is familiar with the Ustore, the campus bookstore. You've probably been there. If not, you've been by it. And so as you can see, the inventory is broken down into textbooks, supplies, and merchandise. I focused the scope of my project on merchandise, basically anything that has a tiger or a Towson logo on it. And then I also focus on spending and inventory because that has increased at the bookstore, but there's no current inventory of vendor management system, which as you will see leads to issues, frustrations, and potential loss of sales. Next slide. Issues arise with receiving inventory at the used store, and there is no current way to resolve it. Temporary solutions are put in place and then quickly moved on with no real and analysis of resolution. This means that the same problem occurs over and over, and there's no way to fix it. And so the scope of this project will further focus on resolving issues that occur during the receiving process, as that's where many of our issues occur. Next slide. There is a lot of literature background and out there about the importance of identifying metrics and key suppliers in order to provide improvement opportunities. Since there were no current system at the U store, this gave me a lot of freedom and creativity to come up with the best new system. Next slide. In order to determine problems with the inventory, I first had to gather data. Working with the merchandise buyer, we identified 10 key vendors, and I was given access to purchase order for the last 4 years. I then analyzed the packing threads, the order forms, and the internal requisition form in order to mine out the data that I needed. Every order contained a requisition form, but not every order contained a packing slip or order form. Therefore, I had to analyze in order to get what I needed. Next slide. Just as there was no vendor management system, there was also no electronic record of receiving and no record of errors. I had to manually collect the data out of bankers' boxes of the last 4 years of purchase order and compile them into a spreadsheet. I recorded the data that specifically affects inventory and receiving, namely order date, ship date, received date, quantity ordered, quantity received, and price. Next slide. After I collected and began to analyze the data, I noticed that 4 key metrics emerged, namely damage, reprice, fulfillment, and lead time. I decided that these were the best 4 measures of vendor effectiveness. A damaged item doesn't necessarily mean an unsellable item. If the item is stained or marked, it can be cleaned and put back on the sales floor. However, the key issue that I wanted to identify is that receiving stained, damaged, or repriced items creates bottlenecks in the receiving process and slows down the inventory replenishment process. Next slide. For the metric calculations, I had to determine the best way to represent the information. As you can see, one of the metric is determined divided by the total number of orders. An order is defined as one item with one SKU number and one individual price. I chose to represent the data not as the number of items damaged, but rather as the number of instances of finding damaged item because it represents interruptions in the supply chain and receiving process. Interruptions are a key measure of vendor performance for this project. Next slide. The fulfillment metric is a very important metric as we saw previously in Nan's presentation. allocation. For the sake of this project, I calculated fulfillment as the number of complete orders divided by the total number of orders. A complete order is when the quantity received is equal to the quantity ordered. And as I saw from my data, that does not always happen. A high percentage of incomplete orders have an impact on the Ustore's ability to meet customer demands, especially now going into the holiday season when our catalog orders are at a premium. Lead time is defined as the amount of work days between the date ordered and the date shipped or the date received, depending on the data available. As I previously mentioned, not all the packing orders or the threads were identical, so I had to sort of go with what I got. Next slide. So what does this data mean? Data without a deliverable is just numbers on a spreadsheet. I propose to have data to be represented in a vendor scorecard. The vendor scorecard has two main elements: metrics and benchmarks. The data for the metrics are taken from shipments received during the previous month. Requisition forms are summarized on a data collection log after each new shipment is received and processed. The log is then given to the merchandise buyer who sorts the log by vendor, totals the sheet, and calculates the measurements of lead time, damage, and reprice rate. The findings are added to the vendor's existing scorecard. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the Ustore had 10 key vendors for their merchandise. Eventually, all of the vendors will have a scorecard. But since this is a new process and will require effort from employees, it is best to implement the change gradually. I performed a cost analysis to determine the top spend and volume vendors, as those will be the vendors that we start with. Those, as previously stated, the scorecards will be prepared monthly. Next slide. And a big thank you to the Ustore who let me go through 4 years of purchase orders and ask a lot of questions and basically be in a corner for 2 months typing on a laptop. Any questions?
Hey, Rachel, it's Professor Bush. Very nice. And certainly you were tenacious enough to go through all that data for 4 years. So good for you. But I just wanted to ask, what constitutes reprice? I think you might have said it, but I didn't grasp it.
Yeah, the reprice is defined as when an item is received, the tags are already printed and attached to the item. It's most likely clothing. And
Got it.
sometimes the SKU doesn't match our system, the price doesn't match our system, and it has to be fixed. These are problems that are easily overcomable. It doesn't mean that the item is unsellable. It just means that an employee has to spend an hour tagging them after the manager spent an hour researching it. So you're looking at 2 hours that could have spent with order fulfillment, but instead, so it's just a reflection on the kinks in the process.
Exactly. And it's a bottleneck. Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Good job.
Great job, Rachel.